Okay, good morning all. As announced, I'll be speaking in English. Sorry about that, just in case if there are a lot of local participants. By the way, just to introduce myself, I'm from ICANN. So my presentation is mostly focusing on to the handling abuses and misuse of DNS. So from that perspective, just to sort of, there have been a lot of discussions even yesterday as well on DNS aspects, but just to sort of give a highlight, as you know, when it comes to DNS, there are of course administrative entities, then there are a lot of operational entities as well. The registrants, they would register domains using registrars, resellers, and so on. Then we have the registries as well. Possibly there might be some domain name registries who are in the room today. And then when it comes to the operational aspects, there are of course parties who manage the authoritative servers, the recursive servers, and so on. So the users would be querying these servers and get the DNS data. Now, especially from an abuse handling perspective, it's important to actually understand some of these contractual relationships, as well as where you should be actually lodging your abuse complaints, and also actually if you are a party who gets an abuse complaint, then what are the processes that you need to be actually supporting in terms of handling those abuse complaints. From ICANN perspective, ICANN has got, as you probably know, the main objective of ICANN is actually to coordinate the internet identifiers. So when we say internet identifiers, things like IP addresses, domain names, and so on. So from that coordination perspective, ICANN has got contractual agreements with several parties. For example, like TLD registries. Now, when it comes to TLD registries, ICANN contracts are with the generic top-level domain registries, or GTLDs basically. Currently, there are over 1,000 generic top-level domain registries exist. And also, now when it comes to the country code top-level domain registries or CCTLDs, ICANN do not have contracts with the CCTLDs because, as you all know, countries are basically sovereign countries, so there won't be any sort of policies that put from ICANN perspective to CCTLDs as such. So there are registry agreements between ICANN and the generic top-level domain registries. Now also there are some the contracts exist from ICANN between the registrars as well. And so those registrars are basically ICANN accredited registrars, and then they have those registry accreditation agreements exist between those entities. There are of course the agreements would exist between the registries and registrars as well. And then obviously when the registrant, when they register a domain name, usually any registrant would go into some sort of agreement, terms of service agreement basically with the reseller or the registrar as well. So there are all these contractual agreements that are in place. So just kind of, in case if someone is abusing any of these contracts, or if someone is actually breaching any of these contracts, then probably you may have to refer to who is the responsible party that the abuse complaint should be lodged. From ICANN perspective, ICANN has got a compliance department or division who would actually handle these complaints that comes in case if that is relevant or if that is breaching the contracts that ICANN has with those contracted parties that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, speaking of course, the DNS abuses, there are lots of maliciously registered domains for various purposes, for criminal activities and things like that. The whole list goes on. You probably know, or, there have been a lot of discussions, as I said before, things like, selling counterfeit goods or data exfiltrations and so on, phishing attacks, malware, and things like that. The list would go on. So these are all, these sort of domains are registered for the purpose of abusers and to actually, so the domains are basically malicious domains. Now, also actually sometimes the miscreants, they could register domains for misusing purposes, like things like, someone could be having their legitimate infrastructure, for example. They may have got their domains for a legitimate purpose for their organization or for their university or whatever, and then the miscreant could be actually taking this properly registered domain to misuse. So basically, they could be actually taking over someone else's infrastructure and then run their infrastructure without knowingly to the party that is actually running that infrastructure. So these things also exist. So someone could be actually hosting DNS infrastructure or the mail servers, DNS servers, and so on. So this is where actually, again, we have to think about various why actually there are lots of targets on DNS. As you know, DNS is of course publicly facing, and nowadays actually there are lots of automated processes do happen, automated emails, and also actually there are lots of registries out there who are actually even offering a lot of free registrations of domains. So there are, easy processes where lots of these malicious domains can be easily registered. So that is why, and there are lots of these inexpensive domains exist. So this is why actually miscreants would actually abuse DNS quite a lot. There have been a lot of discussions again on DDoS related matters. I think from operators' perspective, having those precautions, having those measures to avoid DDoS, I think that would be always helpful. Things like, be aware of making sure that not to run open recursive servers. There are lots of out there. There are lots of open recursive servers out there that can generate a lot of DDoS. Cache poisoning. These are also actually threats to DNS space. Again, there are many ways of doing cache poisoning as well. I think, as overall as service providers, as operators, implementing things like DNSSEC can help quite a lot in this area. So obviously DNSSEC has got two aspects. One is the signing aspect. So if there are any organizations here who are even managing your authoritative servers, I'm sure that, for example, here specifically, CSNIC has done a lot of things, a lot of good for the DNSSEC development, a lot of tools, a lot of things in terms of development. So I think, all these good things has to continue. And then especially if you are managing your authoritative servers, even second levels, I think, you should try to deploy DNSSEC. And also from service providers' perspective, ISP's perspective, try to validate DNSSEC queries or DNS queries, and then make sure your resolvers can validate the DNSSEC-enabled queries. Also, actually, there could be some threats to DNS, especially in the someone could use DNS as a covered malware channel as well. If there are some firewalls, they could send some messages through some DNS related, say for example, there are some bots or malware that could actually pass through the firewalls through some, say they could use some of the text record, TXT records and so on to actually give commands to the malware command and controls. Things like these also, could happen. Fast flux, these sort of services can be again abused as well. The miscreants could be using so many of these IP addresses, domain names. Some could be using a lot of these domain name domain generation algorithms to create a lot of domains, hundreds or thousands a day, and then they could be using so many of these domains, so many of IP addresses, and they could be changing these IP blocks very frequently, IP addresses very frequently through the fast flux. And so you will see very small TTL values and so on in these situations. There are, of course, lots of malware, actually. You may have probably heard about the malware like DNS changer and so on. Once the client hits a malware infected site, the malware could actually change the DNS settings of the device, so the queries could go into a wrong resolver instead of the ISP resolver. So these are again things where DNSSEC can actually protect those sort of attacks as well. These are typically like DNS hijacking type of attacks. So in general, when it comes to the DNS abuse handling or misuse handling, I think the overall, the whole objective here is actually to look at the big picture. If you kind of, if you are focusing on a certain malicious domain, there could be several other factors that are actually relating to this malicious domain. So finding out those, even when if anyone is lodging any abuse complaints, having put all this sort of related information into the abuse complaint, that will help the whoever the service provider or the registrar or the registry to handle these kind of abuses. There are lots of information can be retrieved from the zone data. There are processes again exist if someone want to get certain data related to the TLDs. There are some processes exist, access to repositories are there, and then things like through the zone data you can get information about the name servers, the mail servers, and even a lot of data related to DNS through even like passive DNS databases as well. So historical data also can be retrieved. So things like this will help you quite a lot in terms of processing or finding out various abuses related to DNS. In terms of the registrations, all these links, say for example, if you find a misused domain, finding out more details in the WHOIS database also can be quite helpful as well. When it comes to WHOIS databases, again, there are, as you know, there are different type of WHOIS databases. There are WHOIS databases for registering the names, which is actually done by the registries and registrars and so on. And then you have the name WHOIS, which that register the IP addresses and AS numbers and so on. This is actually done by the regional internet registries. So out there, like depending on the region, there are 5 regional internet registries in the world that exist that would get actually the IP address blocks from IANA, which is again sort of an entity which exists within the ICANN structure. So these databases also actually is quite helpful in terms of lodging the abuse complaints, and also especially from operators' perspective, maintaining the accurate data in the WHOIS database would really help. So the data accuracy is quite important. So ICANN also has a process in terms of, in case if you see that there are some inaccurate WHOIS information, there's a process where you can lodge these inaccurate WHOIS complaints, and then ICANN will look into that. I know that, of course, in this region, in Europe, there is GDPR. So because of the GDPR, some of these fields, especially if you're talking about the domain WHOIS, you will see some of the fields are redacted now. And there are lots of policy work happening around this WHOIS as well. There is also actually a new protocol is being the community has been working on IETF. There have been a lot of work happening around this. Probably you are already aware about the new protocol, which is actually the RDAP, the Registration Data Access Protocol. So this will eventually replace the WHOIS. So RDAP is more expressive in comparison to WHOIS as well, and it's more secure. And also actually that could give you more layered approach in terms of queries and things like that. So that's all happening. In fact, actually the registries and registrars, all the contracted parties that I mentioned to you earlier, they are actually supposed to implement RDAP now from end of August this year. So these are some requirements as well from registries' point of view, registrars' point of view. When it comes to the RIR WHOIS, of course, that all depends on the region. As I said, I'm sure that there could be some representatives from RIPE NCC who can comment on those aspects about the fields and so on. And some other regions, of course, the GDPR may not be applicable, and depending on where the registry, the RIR is located, so they could be actually following the data regulation rule within that country. And then, so these are all kind of things that can be relevant in terms of understanding about the abuses created in the DNS space. If you find the misuse domain, or if you find the malicious domain, this information can be actually you can try to find this information and then use that for your abuse complaint. So I spoke about the WHOIS and also actually spoke about the new RDAP development work as well. So in general, when you handle the domain abuses, it's always important to collect the evidences as much as possible with all those. It could be the IP addresses, it could be the mail server information, it could be where these geolocations and hosting provider details, ISP details, and things like that, always useful. And also from ISP's perspective, I think providing that support to whoever the party that is actually making that abuse complaint, that would be helpful. From service providers' perspective, putting that things like AUPs published, so these would quite be helpful for someone who is actually lodging that abuse complaint. If in case if there are some difficulties in contacting the relevant parties, it could be the service providers, it could be the registrars, there can be some escalation procedures as well. Say, for example, that if you don't get some responses, you could always, if the registrar doesn't respond, as I said, if there are some contracted parties, ICANN has got a compliance department as well to support such situations. You could even go to the registry level, or you could go to ICANN always, but good to see those contractual processes. What are you complaining against, and whether it is being covered by the contracts and so on, or if there are some terms and conditions, terms of service, it's good to actually go through those conditions as well, and refer to those policies before you really lodge that abuse complaint. Also actually working, especially in terms of abuses, like working with the local bodies such as local search, local law enforcement agencies and so on, that would also helpful. And again, with the current policies, there are certain procedures that exist, especially in terms of things like GDPR and so on, where you might probably need some layered approach in these sort of situations. And as I said, ICANN compliance can also answer any questions related to, in case if there are some contract breaches related to those issues. Finally, also actually want to touch on one of the tools that ICANN has. I mean, we have been working with the community in terms of reporting some of these DNS abuses that have been happening. So this tool is called Domain Abuse Activity Reporting System, or simply we call it DAR. So there have been some work going on with the community in terms of, or even as you know, within ICANN we have a lot of these advisory committees and support organization. So from a security point of view, we also have a support advisory committee called SSAC, the Security Stability Advisory Committee. So they are also actually providing a lot of advisories in terms of security. So these are all community groups. You can be part of these community groups and so on. In terms of DAR, the whole idea is actually to report these abuses to the community. So earlier I told you that ICANN has got contracts with the GTLD registries, generic top-level domain registries, over 1,000 or so. So in terms of producing these reports through DAR, we work with these GTLD registries, and we work in terms of the zones, the TLD zones that they manage. And also actually there are some CCTLDs, they could contribute to this as well, voluntary. So that's for CCTLDs, it's a voluntary process more of, but for GTLDs actually we are working based on that contractual process as well. So the whole idea here is that why it's actually different to a usual other reporting system, that's because of, you know, this would go across the whole GTLD space, which is actually over 1,000 GTLD. So that's a lot of data we are talking about. I'm talking about the registration there. So the zone data is one thing, and also actually this would go into the registration data that includes things like the WHOIS data as well. And also some reputation feeds. Again, you know, there are a list of reputation feed providers that, you know, that are actually quite reputed, like in terms of their reputations. So this whole list, you can, if you want to see exactly who these reputation providers and so on, you can actually go through the ICANN website, where if you query this DAR tool, there's a separate page that has got more information about this DAR tool, which includes things like, for example, like APWG, the Anti-Phishing Working Group, and then Spam House, and there are various sort of feeds that collects that information. Also, actually, that accommodates some of the historical studies as well. Mostly these abuses focus on 4 areas. One is actually the malware, the phishing, botnets, and spam. So these are the areas actually this DAR would focus on, and then the reports are being provided. And also you can actually, these reports would come monthly, every end of every month. So even you could, if you go to that DAR page that I mentioned to you, you could even see the last several months, the reports that came out, depending on the month, that every end of this every month, right? So yeah, so these are the things that you can actually again use for understanding more about the abuses that could happen in the DNS space, in the GTLD space, in case if you want to actually use that for even to do any of your sanitizations within your environment, or even actually if you have to do some more research and things like that, also you can use this kind of reporting systems as well. I think, you know, these are the important things. Just wanted to actually highlight in my presentation, especially in terms of handling the abuses and misuse related to the DNS space. And if you have any questions, happy to take some, or I'll be around even during the day, so happy to talk to you as well. Thank you. Yeah.